Thank you very much, Alberto. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to be back in my doctoral alma mater. I was telling my colleagues and students in sociology just across the street on Friday that when we came in the shuttle, from O'Hare, I had this sensation that I hadn't had anywhere before, a sensation of coming home. And I figure that maybe because this is the institution where I spent the most time, about 5.5 years as a student and another year as a visiting faculty back in 89, 1990. So, my reference groups were all here, and it was my pleasure on Friday to realize that although most of the people were different in sociology, the forum was still pretty much the same. I mean, talk about institutionality. That was pretty good. So thank you very much to the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program here for giving me this opportunity to be back. I'm enjoying it tremendously. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview evaluation of what's happened after 20 years of NAFTA, of the North American Free Trade Agreement. There was a lot of discussion in the years prior to the start of NAFTA as to whether there was going to be convergence or divergence, whether convergence was going to be downward to Mexican levels of development, or upward, where Mexico was going to be lifted to US and Canadian levels. So in terms of food, at least, food and agriculture, one of my conclusions that I've reached, and I do warn you that I'm going to present a lot of data here. And it's not like I'm a number cruncher by any stretch of the imagination, in the sense that I don't really do inferential statistics kind of research. But I have been doing a lot of descriptive statistics type of research. And so that's what I'm going to be presenting. So I'm going to be giving you my conclusions from the outset so that there's no mystery here. I think there has been, a lot more prevalence of energy-dense foods, those that are high caloric content, not terribly nutritious, but a lot of calories. Although there have also been higher value added foods, particularly for the North American countries. And so rather than convergence or divergence, my argument is that there's been a differentiated convergence. For instance, Mexican upper or higher income classes have adopted, the niceties of the US diet, whereas the middle and lower income working classes have adopted more the energy-dense types of diets. So on a more general level, these are some of the most general kinds of data that there are. And I mean, all the data I'm using are official data, either from the UN, or the Food and Agriculture Organization, or from World Bank. These particular statistics compare the world ranking as far as gross domestic product goes. The first row is for 1994. The red bars are for 2012. So what we see is that the US was and continues to be #1 in terms of gross domestic product. Canada actually declined to 21, and Mexico declined to 14 in terms of gross domestic product. Now, if you break that down on a per capita basis, it turns out that Canada did better than the other countries. Where the US, even the US, also declined a bit, 1 notch, where in Mexico declined even further from 53rd rank to 61, okay? So that's the general picture, and now I'm going to try to zoom into what happened in terms of agriculture and food. But before doing that, let me just give you an overall insight as to what neoliberal globalism was all about. I mean, what were our politicians trying to do by integrating North America? Well, my assessment, my own view, is that it was primarily trying to cut labor costs. Because the United States was, in a way, having a lot of trouble with competing with the Japanese, with the Germans, other European economies, and so it was in need of lowering labor costs. And so Mexico, of course, has a large young population, and joining in this type of agreement, such as NAFTA, was a very good way of procuring a cheap labor force. This was all in the liberalization ideology, liberalize commodity and investment flows, but don't liberalize the mobility of labor. I mean, labor is to stay in its own national borders, except if you're highly qualified. I mean, I didn't have much problem coming here, but farm workers would have a lot of problems, unless, you know, there are some guest worker programs, particularly, well, in both countries, in both the US and Canada. And so the overall goal was to globalize production and trade. So now, in terms of the neoliberal food regime, and I'm just going to outline this perspective that I've been developing in discussion with Philip McMichael and Harriet Friedman. McMichael is at Cornell, Friedman is at the University of Toronto. They developed this very interesting way of interpreting the food regime in a long sweep of history since the turn of the 20th century. And they identified, first food regime that was led by the UK, a second food regime that was led by the United States, and then in the 1980s, when they published their article, they visualized a third regime that was emerging. We have characterized it as the neoliberal food regime. It's still with US hegemony, and in the sense that the US is promoting its technological paradigm, throughout the world, and also in the sense that its agribusiness multinationals have a tremendous predominance in agricultural production and trade. So in our conceptualization of the neoliberal food regime, we identify the states as being central actors, political economic actors, in terms of neo-regulation. It is a very different type of regulation to the one that predominated in the previous food regime, where food and agriculture were mostly focused on nation states. The point now is, to open up, liberalize agricultures, but the state continues to play a very important role in doing this. So it is the state that is mediating the reconstruction of markets and enabling the predominance of agribusiness multinationals. And one of the main technologies that these multinationals are pushing, and I'm thinking here, for instance, about Monsanto, is biotechnology. So biotechnology products, or biotechnology is, in the history of technological adoption, the technology that has been adopted the fastest. So, the industrial diet. Tony Winson at the University of Guelph, actually, the University of Guelph, he published this book about the industrial diet. He takes a longer sweep than I'm trying to do here, from the 1940s onwards, and maybe even earlier than that. And that consisted of highly processed mass marketing, high fat, high sugar, degraded diets, and I mean all of these results in energy-dense food with low nutritional value. So this is part of the sort of massification of food. And food, by the way, happens to play a particularly important role in the production of profits. How so? Well, the lower food costs are, the lower wages have to be. And the lower the wages have to be for employers, well, the more surplus value there would be for profits. So more particularly with regard to the neoliberal diet, what I'm arguing is that the neoliberal diet is a globalization and intensification of that industrial diet that had been identified by Tony Winson. And you might talk about a nutrition transition, and here I'm trying to bring in some of the epidemiological research, which indicates that the production of vegetable oils, which used to be accessible only to higher income peoples, now they have been pretty much massified. And along with that, there is this epidemiological transition in the sense that in developing countries, there is the overlap of both infectious diseases, which come from food deficiencies, but now combined with non-communicable diseases. That's the NCD here, non-communicable diseases, which used to be associated with affluence. All right, like problems with the heart, diabetes, hypertension. So unfortunately, emerging countries, developing countries have these overlap. So moving on to food and agricultural trade, I will start by highlighting some of the paradoxes of Mexican agriculture right before joining the United States and Canada in the North American Free Trade Agreement. Until 1988, Mexico was largely self-sufficient. There were some imports, there were some exports, but most of its food and agriculture were really concentrated in the national economy. Since NAFTA, there has been a tremendous spike in grains and cereals imports. There has also been some growth in fruit and vegetable exports, but something that perhaps the Mexican politicians did not really anticipate was that fruits and vegetables make up only about 2% of the US Canadian diets, whereas cereals make up about 43% of the Mexican diets. So Mexico has become dependent on the importation of cereals and therefore made its population very vulnerable to any price volatility. So we'll see the impact of that on price inflation. So what we have in Mexico, again, is obesity mixed with food insecurity, and that has generated tremendous out-migration as a survival strategy, and you here are witnessing all these difficulties with the American political class in trying to come up with a way to deal with immigrants, right? Well, this problem is clearly associated to the way Mexico became integrated to the North American economy. So this kind of summarizes the data I'm going to be presenting in a moment. There has been an asymmetric trade increase where the US is the dominant player without any question. Meat consumption increases throughout, especially chicken. And I mean, I have to do a little more research about this, but I think I'm going to claim that chicken has become the neoliberal meat. And chicken, industrially produced chicken, happens to have about 7 times more fat than free-range chicken. Vegetable consumption increased in the US and Canada. It remains pretty flat in Mexico, though, partly because it's become more expensive. I mean, vegetables and fruits become more expensive once Mexico becomes a major exporter of these items, right? I'm going to break down how trade has behaved for each of the partners of the United States. First, for Canada. So Canada, this is Canada's agricultural trade. What you see over here, that this is the trade with the US. Okay, it's very significant increase. This is the trade with Mexico, pretty insignificant in either direction. Although this yellow line here indicates that Canada has actually exported more to Mexico than the other way around. With the United States, Canada is in a better position than the US because Canada has usually exported more to the US than the US has exported to Canada, okay? So overall, I think these patterns, these agricultural trade patterns, kind of confirm the situation that Canada may be the better off of the 3 partners, okay? Not just in per capita income, which I told you about in the beginning, but also in agricultural trade. And that may have to do with the fact that Canada has been a free trader for a much longer time than even the United States. I mean, the US has a fairly protectionist agricultural policy. Canada too, by the way. And Canada continues to be very protectionist, particularly of its dairy industry. And that is one of the stumbling blocks for Canada to engage in a free trade agreement with the European Union. The European Union wants Canada to do away with its milk protectionism. So now let's look at things from the Mexican side. Again, this is Mexico, Canada at the bottom here. Once again, you see that Mexico's imports from Canada are much more important than its exports. Looks a little bigger here because the volumes are a little lower, from the Mexican side than for the Canadian side. But then, looking at the relation with the United States, Mexico has almost always had a trade deficit, an agricultural trade deficit, except at this point, right after there had been a major devaluation of the Mexican peso. Well, Mexico could no longer import that much from the US, but otherwise, big agricultural deficit. And so here, this is the data for poultry supply, chicken. Well, I guess it includes everything. It's turkey, chicken, mostly chicken. So as you can see, Mexico actually opened its borders unilaterally even before NAFTA was in place, in the late 1980s. So, chicken imports spiked since then. Corn imports, I should clarify that this is mostly yellow corn. White corn is used primarily to make tortillas. Yellow corn is used primarily to feed chicken or cows, all right? Or to make high fructose corn syrup, which has been made in Mexico as well. Now this is the importation of soybeans. That's in millions. And I present it here because that also is an indirect way of producing chicken, all right? And this is net poultry imports in terms of millions. So what's happening in Mexico is there's tremendous increase in the importation of chicken and a tremendous increase in the production of chicken within Mexico. There are these 3, I believe, huge corporations, including one Mexican. It's actually a Mexican transnational that has a tremendous presence in Central America. but also Tyson, which is, I think, the largest producer in the US. So how does all of these food dependency translate into food intake and inequality? I guess I took this picture actually from an article, a very recent article, on how, there are a lot of criticisms on Peña Nieto's poverty alleviation program, because what scholars are finding is that a lot of the disbursements are being spent mostly in energy-dense stuff, like Coca-Cola. There was a more dramatic cartoon of, these indigent person in the city, surrounded by bags of Cheetos and Fritos and that kind of thing. But unfortunately, that particular newspaper had its webpage protected, so I couldn't pirate the cartoon. Good idea. All right, I'll think about that one. So this is, I'm taking a really long sweep here in terms of caloric intake. Okay, this is kilocalories per capita per day. Since 1961, that's the earliest date for which we have data in the Food and Agriculture Organization database. And so, to me, one of the most interesting parts here is that, this red line, which corresponds to Mexico, that's Canada, that's the US, is that Mexico actually did better before the opening, in terms of food intake anyway. And after that, Mexico's food intake has been mostly flat. These increases, I would argue, are primarily due to increased meat consumption, mostly by the wealthier classes, beef, chicken, like I said, chicken primarily. It's a differentiated consumption, by the way. I mean, beef goes mostly to the upper income classes. Chicken goes to, more widespread in terms of class accessibility, and I will present some data on that. So this breaks it down or focuses on meat. The USA, has continued to increase its meat consumption. By the way, that is in spite of the fact that beef consumption in the US has declined. So this increase here is primarily due to poultry. Canada's, well, it's, mostly flat, but kind of converging to US levels. Here, Mexico has increased from a fairly low base. Look at, this actually starts at the 100 level. So sometimes I change the scale, so it all starts at 100. Okay, let me zoom into how, the food supply ratios. This is an extremely simple analysis of in what period do we have the main gains in food intake, okay? So I split this in, this basically divides the food intake in 2009 and divides it by the food intake in 1991. And this is, where there was a very substantial increase. But interestingly for Mexico, 5 years as a student and another year as a visiting faculty back in 89, 1990. So, my reference groups were all here, and it was my pleasure on Friday to realize that although most of the people were different in sociology, the forum was still pretty much the same. Talk about institutionality. That was pretty good. So thank you very much to the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program here for giving me this opportunity to be back. I'm enjoying it tremendously. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview evaluation of what's happened after 20 years of NAFTA, of the North American Free Trade Agreement. There was a lot of discussion in the years prior to the start of NAFTA as to whether there was going to be convergence or divergence, you know, whether convergence was going to be downward to Mexican levels of development, or upward, you know, where Mexico was going to be lifted to US and Canadian levels. So in terms of food, at least, food and agriculture, one of my conclusions that I've reached, and I do warn you that I'm going to present a lot of data here. And it's not like I'm a number cruncher by any stretch of the imagination, in the sense that I don't really do inferential statistics kind of research, but I have been doing a lot of descriptive statistics. Thank you very much, Alberto. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to be back in my doctoral alma mater. I was telling my colleagues and students in sociology just across the street on Friday that when we came in the shuttle, you know, from O'Hare, I had this sensation that I hadn't had anywhere before, a sensation of coming home. And I figure that maybe because this is the institution where I spend the most time, about 5.5 type of research. And so that's what I'm going to be presenting. So I'm going to be giving you my conclusions from the outset so that there's no mystery here. I think there has been, you know, a lot more prevalence of energy-dense foods, those that are high caloric content, not terribly nutritious, but a lot of high calories. Although there have also been higher value added foods.